Gerald Smith sat in the dark, his eyes fixed on the monitors, watching his sons. He had done this for years now, watching every movement, every breath, every whisper. The cameras in every corner of his massive house were a constant reminder of the walls he had built around himself and his family. Trust, he had learned, was a fragile thing. His sons, Mason and Henry, were just 4 years old, their bodies broken by the accident that had taken their mother from them. Their once lively eyes now stared blankly, their wheelchairs silent, as they sat in the playroom. Gerald watched them through the lens of his security cameras as if they were in another world, a world where he could still protect them from the chaos he couldn't control. He had watched others fail them before. 7 caregivers, 7 people who had come into his life, promising to help. But each of them had betrayed him in one way or another. One had sold pictures of the twins to the press. One had stolen medications. One had vanished with their therapy schedules in the middle of the night. Gerald had learned the hard way. People couldn't be trusted. And so, when Samantha Brown had come into his life, he treated her like the others, just another risk. She arrived with only a small suitcase, too calm, too quiet. Gerald didn't ask many questions. He didn't need to. He handed her the contract and watched. He would watch her just like the others, waiting for the moment when she would slip, when her mask would fall. But what he saw that night stopped his heart. It was a routine check like any other. Gerald sat in his study, his fingers wrapped around his coffee mug, waiting for the usual signs. But this night was different. The monitor flickered to a live feed of the playroom, where Samantha was kneeling between his sons. He leaned forward, squinting at the screen. What was she doing? At first, he thought nothing of it. She had done her job before, helping them with their exercises, speaking to them softly as she coaxed them into movements their bodies refused to make. But then his breath caught. Samantha was singing to them. It wasn't just any song, though. It was a lullaby. Gerald's eyes widened in disbelief. He had heard that song 1,000 times before, a song his late wife, Rachel, used to sing to their sons every night. No one else had ever sung it, not since the night of the accident. Not since Rachel was taken from them. Gerald's heart pounded as he watched Samantha continue, her voice soft and soothing, just like Rachel's had been. She was leaning over the boys, her hands resting gently on their shoulders as she sang. Gerald's coffee slipped from his hands, shattering against the floor as his world tilted. How did she know that song? His pulse raced, his mind scrambling to make sense of it. He had watched Samantha every day, every night, scrutinizing every moment. She had never mentioned the song. She had never shown any sign that she knew about Rachel's lullaby. And yet, here she was, singing it as though it was something she had always known. Gerald's hands shook as he reached for his phone, but he didn't call anyone. He couldn't. He waited. Watched. After a few minutes, Samantha stood up, brushing a hand across her forehead, her face a mask of calm as she turned to leave the room. Gerald's eyes never left the screen as she walked down the hallway, her footsteps light. He didn't move until she was out of sight. Then, slowly, he stood up, his body trembling. Something wasn't right. There was something about Samantha that didn't add up. She wasn't just a caregiver. She wasn't just another person he had to watch. Gerald stood frozen in the hallway, his mind racing. His pulse pounded in his ears as he made his decision. He wasn't going to let this go. He would find out what she was hiding. Samantha was hiding something. And Gerald had just realized that the secret she was keeping was something far bigger than he could ever have imagined. The silence of the house pressed in on him, suffocating, as he walked toward the door to her quarters. His feet felt heavy as he reached for the handle, the cold metal sending a chill through his fingers. He opened the door slowly, stepping into her room, the dim light casting long shadows across the floor. He glanced around the room quickly, looking for anything that might give him an answer. It was the same as it had been when she arrived. A bed, a small dresser, and a desk with a few papers scattered on top. Nothing unusual. But then his eyes caught something. The top drawer of her desk was slightly open. He moved toward it, his breath shallow, and gently pulled it open. Inside, there was a photograph. The image was face down, but the edges were worn, as if it had been handled frequently. Gerald hesitated for only a moment before turning it over. When he saw what was on the other side, his world stopped. The photo showed a much younger Samantha, wearing a paramedic uniform, kneeling on the side of a dark motorway. The lights of an ambulance flashed in the background. She looked exhausted, her face stained with something that looked like blood. Her eyes were tired, but there was a strength in them, a strength that Gerald didn't recognize. And then he saw the date written on the back of the photo, September 17th, 2022. The night of the accident. Gerald's chest tightened. His hands trembled as he held the photo, his mind racing. There was no mistaking it now. This woman had been there, on that night, when everything had fallen apart. She had been the one to save his sons. She had been the one who had pulled them from the wreckage of the car, the one who had spoken to his wife in her final moments. Rachel's last words, the ones she had whispered to Samantha before she died, echoed in his mind. "Find my boys. Promise me." The words felt like a punch to the gut, and Gerald's legs gave out beneath him. He dropped to his knees on the floor, the photograph still in his hands. The truth was more than he could bear. Samantha hadn't just been hired to care for his sons. She had been there the night everything changed. She had made a promise to Rachel. But why hadn't she told him? Why hadn't she said anything? His mind was spinning as he stood up, pacing the room, trying to make sense of everything. Why had Samantha come into his life like this? Why had she hidden the truth? Was she trying to replace Rachel? Was she here to manipulate him, to make him believe she was the answer to all of his problems? He didn't know, but he had to find out. Gerald's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. A message from his investigator. He read it quickly, his heart racing again. Found hospital records. Brown was admitted the same night as your wife. Obstetrics emergency. Baby didn't survive. Thought you should know. Gerald's chest tightened painfully. Samantha had lost a child that night, too. She had given everything, her career, her life, her future, just to keep a promise to a dying woman she barely knew. His hands shook as he read the message again, his mind reeling. What was he supposed to do with this information? How could he face Samantha now that he knew the truth? But before he could think further, he heard footsteps in the hallway. It was Samantha, and she was about to walk into his life, bringing with her a truth he wasn't ready to face. Gerald stood frozen in his study, the photograph of Samantha in his hands, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. His mind was reeling, trying to make sense of everything. His wife, Rachel, had died in that accident, and now, after all these years, the woman who had helped save their sons was living under his roof, pretending to be a stranger. Why hadn't she told him? Why had she waited until now to reveal her connection to that night? His heart raced as the camera feed on his monitor flickered to life. The playroom. His sons, Mason and Henry, were sitting together, their wheelchairs facing each other as they watched Samantha. She was kneeling in front of them, helping Mason with his physical therapy exercises. Her hands were gentle but firm as she guided his weak arms, coaxing him to lift them with her soft encouragement. But there was something different this time. Gerald could see it, even through the monitor. Samantha was no longer just the caregiver. She was someone who understood their pain, someone who knew their grief in a way that no one else could. The lullaby, the photograph, the way she spoke to his sons as if she knew them better than anyone. Gerald's chest tightened. There was something far more complex going on here than he had initially realized. He turned away from the monitor, rubbing his face with both hands. He couldn't process all of this at once. He needed answers, but he wasn't ready to confront Samantha. Not yet. Not until he knew more. But the next morning, as he sipped his coffee in the kitchen, he heard the sound of Mason's laughter. Real laughter, the kind that had been missing for so long. Gerald stood in the doorway, watching silently. Samantha was sitting with the boys at the table, reading them a book. She was making silly voices, getting them to giggle, and for the first time in years, Gerald felt a tiny flicker of hope. The boys were laughing. They were alive in a way that hadn't been possible since the accident. "Mason, do it again," Samantha said, her voice full of warmth. "Do the funny voice again," Mason said, grinning as he leaned forward. Gerald's heart ached as he watched them. This wasn't just a caregiver doing her job. This was something more. Samantha wasn't here to replace Rachel, but it felt like she was picking up the pieces that had been shattered. And Gerald couldn't understand why. He turned away from the doorway, his mind in turmoil. Why did he feel this way about Samantha? Why was he beginning to trust her, even though she had been hiding the truth from him? Why did it feel like she had become more than just a stranger in his home? Later that afternoon, after the boys had gone to sleep, Gerald found himself standing in front of Samantha's room again. His thoughts swirled with questions, doubts, and a growing sense of confusion. He had to know more. He knocked lightly on her door, his heart thumping in his chest. It felt like he was walking into a trap, but he couldn't stop himself. He needed the truth. Samantha opened the door slowly, her expression calm, almost serene, as if she had been expecting this moment. Her eyes met his, and for a brief second, he saw something flicker behind them, a mixture of fear, relief, and something else he couldn't quite name. "Mr. Smith," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Is something wrong?" Gerald swallowed hard, his throat tight. He felt like he was drowning in his own questions. He held the photograph up in front of her, his hands shaking slightly. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why did you hide this from me?" Samantha's eyes widened, and for a split second, Gerald saw the walls she had built around herself crack. But she didn't answer right away. She just stood there, staring at the photo, her breath shallow. "I had to," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "I couldn't tell you. Not like this. Not yet." Gerald's chest tightened.
Why?
"Why didn't you tell me you were the one who helped save my sons? Why didn't you tell me that my wife asked you to look after them?" Her expression faltered for just a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "I made a promise to your wife, Gerald," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with pain. "And I kept that promise. I couldn't tell you because I knew it would hurt too much. I didn't come here for sympathy. I came here because I made a promise to her." Gerald's heart pounded in his chest. What did she say? What were her last words? Samantha closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if gathering the strength to say the words. "She told me to find you, to find your boys, to love them the way she would have. And I promised her I would." She looked at Gerald, her eyes full of sorrow. "I kept my word, Gerald. That's why I'm here. I wasn't trying to replace her. I just wanted to keep my promise." Gerald stood there, frozen, the weight of her words crashing down on him. He had always feared losing control of everything, but now it felt like he was losing something more. His sons had been saved that night, but he had lost so much more than he ever realized. He had lost Rachel, but now he was realizing he was in danger of losing something else, the trust he had built with Samantha, a woman who had sacrificed everything for his family. But before he could speak again, his phone buzzed. Gerald glanced at it, his breath catching in his throat. It was a message from his investigator. "Found hospital records. Brown was admitted same night as your wife. Obstetrics emergency. Baby didn't survive. Thought you should know." Gerald's stomach dropped. He read the message again, the words sinking in like a blade to his chest. Samantha had lost a child that night, too. She had given everything to save his sons, and now she was here, living in his house, taking care of them like they were her own. His mind raced, his thoughts a blur. He couldn't process it all at once. His fingers trembled as he put the phone down and looked at Samantha. "I need time," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Samantha nodded quietly. "I understand." Gerald turned away from her, his mind spinning. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do next. He had so many questions. But for now, the one thing that stood out above all the rest was the most haunting question of all. What had Rachel seen in Samantha that he couldn't? The morning after his confrontation with Samantha, Gerald sat at his desk, staring at the empty space where the photograph of Samantha had been. His hands were still shaking from the shock of everything he had uncovered and everything he had yet to understand. The truth was heavy in his chest, pressing him down like a boulder. Samantha wasn't just a stranger hired to care for his sons. She was someone tied to his family in ways he couldn't yet grasp. He had spent the last few hours going over the hospital records that his investigator had sent. Samantha had been admitted the same night as Rachel. She had lost a child in the chaos of that night, the night his wife had died and his sons had been torn from the wreckage. Gerald hadn't realized how much he didn't know about that night. All the news articles he had read, all the reports he had memorized had been about the crash itself, about the wreckage, about the lives his family had lost. But there had been a story hidden in the background that no one had bothered to tell him. It was about Samantha, the woman who had been there in the ambulance, saving his sons while losing her own child. Gerald rubbed his temples, the weight of the truth threatening to collapse him. He needed to understand. He needed answers, and this time, he wasn't going to sit back and wait for them to fall into his lap. He was going to find them. The next day, after the boys had gone down for their afternoon nap, Gerald made his decision. He was going to confront the situation head-on. He would dig deeper into Samantha's past. Every detail. Every piece of information. He had been too naive to trust her before, but now he had no choice. He had to know what was real and what Samantha was hiding. Gerald started with what he knew, her medical history. He pulled up the records from St. George's Hospital again, the ones that had indicated her emergency admission after the crash. It didn't take long for him to dig through the layers of paperwork until he found what he was looking for. Samantha had been treated for complications during the aftermath of the crash. It wasn't just the premature labor, it was something more. There had been a traumatic injury that had sent her to the hospital, one that hadn't been reported. He frowned, squinting at the screen. The details were sketchy, buried beneath medical jargon, but one thing stood out. Samantha had been treated for psychological trauma, a deep emotional wound caused by the accident. Her medical records hinted at an ongoing struggle with grief, but it didn't explain everything. What had happened to her that night? What had driven her to the breaking point? Gerald's mind raced as he continued to search. He opened up an encrypted news database, one that he rarely used. A few minutes of clicking and scrolling, and his eyes landed on a local news story from the night of the crash, a piece he hadn't seen before. It wasn't much. Just a small blurb buried at the bottom of the article, a mention of the first responders, the paramedics who had saved his sons. And then, there it was, a photograph of Samantha. She was standing in the background of a group of paramedics, her face bloodied, her eyes haunted. The caption read, "Paramedic Samantha Brown, who assisted in the rescue, was later hospitalized after complications related to the incident." Gerald's pulse quickened as he clicked on the link to the full article, trying to make sense of the words that had eluded him for so long. The details were sparse, but he could see the effect the crash had had on Samantha. The photograph told a story of someone who had been changed by what they had witnessed, someone who had seen too much. The article mentioned nothing about her personal life, her losses. But the look in Samantha's eyes, the weariness, the pain, was enough to make Gerald feel like he was missing something vital. There was more to her story than she was letting on. As he continued his search, one thing became clear. Samantha had been there the night his sons were in the car, but she hadn't been there just as a paramedic. She had been there as a person who had been deeply affected by the chaos of that night. Her own grief was intertwined with theirs. She had lost her child, and yet she had stayed, caring for Gerald's sons as if they were her own. Gerald's heart ached as the pieces began to fit together. This wasn't just about the past. This was about someone who had sacrificed everything, who had carried their shared pain for all these years. But what had she sacrificed for? What did she want from him? Was this all just part of the promise she had made to Rachel? The tension inside him began to build again. His chest tightened as he stared at the screen, unable to look away from the photograph of Samantha. He didn't know whether he could trust her. He didn't know whether he wanted to. But he also knew one thing. He couldn't let her go without understanding who she really was. He needed to confront her again, to ask the questions that had been haunting him ever since he first saw her. The truth had to come out, no matter how painful it would be. He stood up and walked to the hallway, his mind racing. It was time to confront Samantha. He needed answers. He needed to know who she really was. As he approached her room, he stopped outside the door. His heart was pounding in his chest. He couldn't stop the thoughts racing through his mind. What if she didn't tell me everything? What if she's hiding something else? Gerald took a deep breath and knocked on her door. Samantha opened it almost immediately, her calm expression giving nothing away. "Mr. Smith," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "I need to talk to you," Gerald said, his voice tight. She nodded and stepped aside, allowing him to enter. He walked in slowly, his heart beating in his throat. This was it. This was the moment when everything would change. He couldn't walk away anymore. "I've been looking into you," Gerald began, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I know the truth now. You were there that night. You were the one who saved my sons." Samantha didn't flinch. Her expression remained unchanged, her eyes locked onto his. "Yes," she said quietly, her voice unwavering. "I was there." Gerald took a step forward, the distance between them closing. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me what really happened that night?" Samantha's gaze softened. "I didn't come here to reopen old wounds. I came here because I made a promise. A promise to Rachel." Her words hung in the air, and Gerald felt the weight of them settle deep in his chest. He could feel the flood of emotion rising inside him, threatening to spill over. But he wasn't ready to hear it yet. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked again, his voice tight. Samantha paused, her eyes studying him carefully before she answered. "Because," she said softly, "I didn't know how to explain that I had been carrying this pain with me, too. I didn't know how to tell you that I had lost everything that night. I didn't know how to tell you that your wife asked me to take care of your sons, and I made a promise that I would." Gerald's throat tightened, and he felt a wave of guilt wash over him. All this time, he had seen Samantha as just another person to watch, another risk. But she had been there, carrying her own loss, her own grief, right alongside his. The truth was unraveling, piece by piece, and Gerald didn't know whether he was ready for it. But one thing was certain, his world was changing again, and he wasn't sure if he was prepared for what was coming next. The days that followed were filled with silence. Gerald found himself consumed by the weight of everything he had learned about Samantha, about the promise she had made to Rachel, and about his own inability to trust. It wasn't just his sons who had been affected that night, it was Samantha too. She had lost a child in the aftermath of the crash, but she had still stayed. She had kept her promise, even when it meant sacrificing so much. Gerald was torn. Part of him wanted to believe her, to trust her, to accept that she was here because of Rachel's dying wish. But the other part of him, the part that had spent so many years locked behind walls of suspicion and fear, couldn't let go of the doubt that still gnawed at him. Each day, he watched her more carefully, scrutinizing every move, every word. Samantha's presence in the house was a constant reminder of what he had lost and what she had given up to keep her promise. But despite all his questions, all his doubts, one thing was becoming clear. His sons were attached to her. Mason and Henry, once so quiet, now laughed when she played with them. They trusted her in a way that they hadn't trusted anyone else since the accident. It was both comforting and terrifying for Gerald to watch. His sons needed her, and that realization scared him more than anything. That evening, Gerald was sitting in his office, the monitors in front of him, when he heard the sound of footsteps outside the door. He looked up to see Samantha standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. The moment their eyes met, Gerald felt his heart beat a little faster. There was no turning back now. The time for questions had passed. Now it was time for the truth. "You've been watching me," she said softly, her voice calm, but there was a hint of something else, something raw beneath her words. "I know." Gerald didn't speak right away. He just nodded, his throat tight with emotion. It had been the only way he could cope. Watching, waiting, hoping that the truth would reveal itself in time. But now that the truth was starting to come to light, he felt more conflicted than ever. "I'm sorry," Gerald said, his voice hoarse, more to himself than to her. I've been trying to protect them, but I've pushed you away and I don't know what to believe anymore. Samantha stepped into the room, closing the door behind her with a soft click. She walked slowly toward him, her eyes never leaving his. Gerald could feel the tension between them, thick and suffocating. But she didn't stop. She stopped just a few steps away from him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. I know you're scared, Samantha said quietly, her voice soft but firm. But you have to understand something. I'm not here to replace Rachel. I'm here because she asked me to take care of them. And I will, Gerald. I'll do it because I promised her. Gerald's chest tightened as he listened. He could hear the conviction in her voice. And yet, a part of him still couldn't let go of the fear that had taken root so deep inside of him. The fear of losing more. The fear that this was too much to trust, too much to accept. I know you didn't ask for this, Samantha continued, her voice barely above a whisper. But I'm here. I'm here for your sons. And I'm here for you, too. But you have to trust me. You have to let me in. Gerald's mind raced. He knew that Samantha had been through something painful. He knew that she had given up so much for the promise she made to Rachel. But trust was a different thing altogether. How could he trust her when he was so afraid of losing everything? How could he open his heart to someone who had already hidden so much? For the first time in days, Gerald felt a strange mix of clarity and confusion. His sons needed Samantha, and in some ways he did too. But could he let her stay? Could he risk opening himself up again? I've watched you, Gerald said quietly, his voice shaky. I've watched you care for them, protect them, love them. And I don't know how to feel about it. I don't know how to let you in. Samantha's eyes softened as she stepped closer, her gaze steady, but filled with understanding. Gerald, you don't have to do this alone. I'm not asking you to forget what happened. I'm not asking you to forget Rachel. But I'm asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to trust that I'm here for them, and for you. Gerald swallowed hard, his throat dry, his heart pounding. Every fiber of his being wanted to resist. But as he looked at her, standing there in front of him, there was something in her eyes that made him want to believe her. Something in her voice that made him want to trust her. I'm scared, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. I'm scared of losing more. I've already lost so much. Samantha took another step toward him, her presence warm and steady. I know. I understand. But if you keep holding on to that fear, if you keep pushing everyone away, you'll lose what matters most. And I'm not going anywhere. I'm here for as long as you need me. Gerald closed his eyes for a moment, letting her words sink in. Could he trust her? Could he let her stay in their lives? For so long, he had kept everyone at a distance, locked away behind his walls, afraid of the pain of losing more. But now he was standing at the edge of something new. Something he wasn't sure he was ready for. I don't know if I can, he whispered. Samantha reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch gentle but firm. You don't have to decide everything right now. But you need to understand something. You're not alone anymore. You don't have to carry this weight on your own. Gerald's chest tightened as he looked at her, the enormity of her words hitting him all at once. He had spent so long in isolation, so long in fear, that he had forgotten what it was like to let someone in. To trust. To love again. But he wasn't ready to make that decision. Not yet. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps outside the door interrupted the moment. Gerald's heart skipped a beat. It was Mason, the sound of his wheelchair creaking as it moved down the hallway. Daddy. Mason's small voice called from the door. Where's Sam? I need her. Gerald turned to Samantha, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and fear. Samantha gave him a gentle smile, her eyes warm. Without saying a word, she walked toward the door, her steps quiet but certain. She opened it, and Gerald watched as she knelt down in front of Mason, her voice soft and comforting as she reassured him. I'm here, sweetie, Samantha said gently, her voice full of warmth. I'm right here. Gerald stood frozen in place, his heart heavy. He knew he had a choice to make. And whatever that choice was, he knew it would change everything. The days that followed were filled with tension, uncertainty, and a quiet, lingering unease. Gerald had spent years building walls around himself and his family, surrounding them with security, monitoring every step. He had told himself it was for their protection. But now, with Samantha still in his home, his walls felt less like safety and more like a prison. He had watched her from the shadows, waiting for the moment when the cracks in her story would show. He had hoped to find a lie, something to confirm the suspicions gnawing at him. But every time he looked at her, he found only kindness. Samantha wasn't just a caregiver. She was a lifeline, something he hadn't realized he needed until it was almost too late. Mason and Henry had begun to trust her in a way he couldn't quite fathom. They laughed again. They spoke more. They lived. And while Gerald knew his sons needed her, part of him still fought the fear that trusting her could break them again. But the truth was staring him in the face. Samantha wasn't a stranger. She wasn't someone trying to replace Rachel. She was a woman who had been there when it mattered most, when everything had fallen apart, and had made a promise to a dying woman to take care of her children. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Gerald sat in his office, the quiet hum of the monitors filling the space around him. He leaned forward in his chair, his eyes scanning the feed, watching his sons sleep peacefully in their beds. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the weight of the world crushing him. His sons were alive. They were okay. And for that, he had Samantha to thank. Gerald's mind wandered back to that photograph, the one of Samantha on the side of the road, covered in blood, her eyes haunted by the trauma of what she had witnessed. He remembered the promise Rachel had made. "Find my boys. Promise me." He had been angry at first. How could she hide such a huge part of herself from him? Why hadn't she told him the truth? But now, sitting in the quiet of his office, it made sense. She had done what Rachel had asked her to do. She had promised to care for his sons, to love them the way Rachel would have. And in the end, that promise was worth everything. Gerald stood up and walked down the hallway, his footsteps quiet against the hardwood floor. He reached the playroom door and paused, his hand resting on the cool metal handle. Inside, he could see Samantha sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, holding the twins as they slept, their small hands resting in her lap. It was a scene that should have filled him with unease, but instead, it filled him with something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. He knocked softly on the door before opening it. Samantha looked up at him, her eyes soft and tired, but filled with an understanding that went beyond words. She smiled faintly, and he could see the tenderness in her expression as she carefully laid the twins back into their beds. "Mr. Smith," she said softly, her voice gentle. "Is everything okay?" Gerald nodded, taking a slow breath, trying to gather the words he knew he needed to say. "Samantha," he began, his voice low, I've spent so much time fighting this. Fighting you, fighting myself, trying to control everything." He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "But the truth is, I don't know how to trust anyone anymore. I didn't know how to trust you." Samantha didn't say anything. She just stood up slowly, walking over to him, her eyes never leaving his. The air between them was charged, heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Gerald's chest tightened as she came closer, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something inside him loosen. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have seen this sooner. You've been here all along, giving everything for my sons. And I've just been so scared of losing them, of losing control, that I almost pushed away the one person who could help them heal." Samantha's gaze softened, and she placed a hand gently on his arm. "Gerald," she said, her voice steady but full of compassion, "you've been through so much. I understand why you were afraid. But you can't do this alone. No one can. You're not supposed to carry all this by yourself." Gerald's eyes filled with tears, his emotions overwhelming him. He had been so stubborn, so trapped in his grief, that he hadn't seen the one thing that had been right in front of him all along. Samantha wasn't just a caregiver. She was the answer to a prayer he didn't even know he had been asking. "I've watched you," he whispered. "I've watched you sacrifice everything for them. And I don't know how to repay you for that." He paused, his breath shaky. I don't know how to say thank you for what you've done for us. Samantha's face softened, and she reached up, brushing a tear from his cheek. You don't have to thank me, she said quietly. I made a promise. I'm here because your wife trusted me with her most precious gift. And I'm here because I believe in you. I believe in what you can be, if you just let yourself believe in it too. Gerald's heart clenched, his chest tight with emotion. He had spent so many years burying his pain, building walls to keep everyone out, and now, standing in front of Samantha, he realized just how much he had lost in the process. But more than that, he realized what he had the chance to gain. You're right, Gerald said, his voice breaking slightly. I've been so afraid of losing them that I didn't see what was right in front of me. But I see it now. I see you. And I see my sons. And I see the future they can have if I just let go of the fear. Samantha smiled softly, her eyes filled with understanding. It's not easy, Gerald. But you're not alone in this anymore. And neither are they. Gerald took a deep breath, looking at her with newfound clarity. He had fought so hard to protect them, but now he realized that protecting them meant trusting others too. It meant trusting the people who had sacrificed for them, who had been there when he couldn't be. For the first time in years, Gerald felt the heavy burden of grief, and fear began to lift. It wasn't gone. Nothing ever could make the pain of losing Rachel disappear. But it was lighter now. He was ready to take the next step. Thank you, he whispered again, his voice thick with emotion. Samantha nodded, her smile warm and comforting. You don't have to thank me, she said. Just love them. Love them the way she would have wanted. Gerald took a deep breath and nodded. For the first time in years, he felt like he was finally moving forward. The house wasn't as quiet as it had been. It wasn't just full of silence anymore. It was full of something else. Something real. The weight of his fear still lingered, but it was no longer all-consuming. He had made a choice. He had chosen to trust. And with that trust came hope. The end. Subscribe to this channel to support our growth.